The spoiler warning, presented by the products and services, of course.
Brought to you by Product.
HelloFresh, get in touch.
Gentlemen, I give you the future.
It's almost like we know what we're doing.
Shows up as a wonderful, clear spike.
Wonderful little bar. So this is a review of the adventure module Deathwatch Program for 2300 AD. Originally published in, I think it was 1990, although we were running it with the new updated version of 2nd edition Mongoose Travelers 2300 AD. My name is Taranaki. My pronouns are she, her. Does everyone want to introduce themselves?
Yes, my name, for the purposes of this recording, will be Pixel, pronouns he, him.
I am Rosary, she, her.
Dispensed, she, her.
And of course, Craig, the bot.
Craig's here too.
We do love Craig.
Awesome. So let's start by talking about what 2300 AD is, because that is quite an obscure setting these days, I think. Originally an alternative setting, well, not even an alternative setting, a spin-off of both Traveller and Twilight 2000, using a slightly more hard sci-fi aesthetic than the regular Traveller. And then later on in its original run, towards 1990, as games like Shadowrun and Cyberpunk were coming out, they added more cyberpunk elements to the game, which at the time wasn't very popular, and people kind of criticised it at the time, although I criticised it as being a cash-in on the cyberpunk zeitgeist. But I think these days in 2020, the idea of a sci-fi RPG without cyberpunk elements is somewhat risible.
This was back when the entire cyberpunk genre was Neuromancer and Blade Runner, and there was this new-fangled thing called Cyberpunk 2013.
And definitely in looking through the art in the book, you can get that very strong sense of that Cyberpunk 2013 vibe, or at least I did, having at least at a few points glanced at those earlier books, even if I haven't had the chance to play them.
Well, I think the artwork on the inside cover is very, very vaporwave, in a way that I didn't think anything actually was.
The overriding impression I got from the art was, here's a trucker from an actual truck stop hanging out with Snake Plissken and something from Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah, Snake Plissken is most definitely there, along with a very clearly biomod, and of course very vaporwave. And I can't remember what game it is, but it's one of the very old arcade tank games, just hanging out in the background.
Well, everything in that artwork is supposed to be things that are in the adventure. Like you've got the ship at the top of it is the Daisy May from the end of the adventure, and at the bottom, I guess it's the Operation Wild Goose portion of the adventure.
The Daisy May being Sir not appearing in our version of the playthrough.
Well, yes.
I don't think we encountered Snake Plissken either, unfortunately.
Yes, but when they remade this game in, I think originally 2013 was when the first edition Mongoose Traveller version of this game 2300 came out. They didn't update any of the cyberpunk modules, because this is part of, I think, a trilogy of cyberpunk / core world focused stuff. Instead, all of the Mongoose Traveller stuff focused on republishing what they called the French Arm adventures.
French Arm being a major aspect of this setting.
Yes, about a third of colonized space.
Personally, I did enjoy reading through the list of names, only to land on the Canadian Finger, which is it's a fun little callback to home, at least.
Well, the idea of arms and fingers is because of the way the faster than light drive works in this setting, meaning that you have to stop every 7.7 light years to regenerate the drive, and that means that you kind of have to take these brachiating paths. So all of the as you go further out, you have to go through the same rest stops.
Well, and it's just sort of sensible spaceward expansion to have those sort of clear lanes in order to build them up to have ready access to resupply, refueling. It just makes sense to build a line of expansion.
It's much better for expedition planning as well, because then there's always the clear spots of, hey, we need to spot here, 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 and here, get all the stuff together and figure out what's going on, do some routine maintenance and so on and so forth, but that's expedition management.
So, do we want to start talking more about, I guess, what Deathwatch Program is? I know we kind of touched on it with the artwork in the front cover. I think the book itself, it kind of naturally falls into two parts. The first half of the book is the first mission you're on, which is Operation Wild Goose, and then the second part is the part that actually concerns the titular Deathwatch program.
The layout of pages in the book certainly agrees with you, even if your actual playing experience may differ, because half of the book is Operation Wild Goose, and half of it is everything else.
And partially by that layout, I think you would find it very difficult for your players to jump too far off the rails in the ordering of this, just given the catalyst for events that culminates in the titular Deathwatch is ultimately taking place in the course of the first half, sort of off-screen in a metaphorical sense.
Yeah, and I think at the end, I was going to discuss this later, but at the end of the book it mentions running this as an adventure for Cyberpunk or Shadowrun. And I think that first part of the book, the Operation Wild Goose, is probably the part that most easily lends itself to being adapted for sort of generic cyberpunk, sci-fi, on-the-ground RPG, which is perhaps a little bit silly given the name of the book. So, shall we go on to talk about what Operation Wild Goose actually is? I know you, Pixel, you wanted to mention, even before we started recording this, how much of that adventure is made up of delays.
Yes. From the very first moment after the player characters are introduced to the mission, you will find pretty much at least once every paragraph, if not multiple times per paragraph, describing the progression of the operation. And it will suggest various forms of delays, starting from people removing heavy equipment from the elevator that takes 1d6 minutes, and getting their car out of parking taking 1d6 minutes, and getting out on the road to start driving to the first checkpoint of the operation. We haven't covered it yet, but Macrodyne Industries, to get together for the operation, roll 3d10 for the amount of time it takes them in traffic. Once you're there, roll 1d6 for every piece of equipment you examine, and 3d6 for the amount of time it takes to coordinate everything and get in contact and check the radios. It's very prolific and stands out quite noticeably as, I think, an artifact of an older style of RPG design, rather than giving more rough estimates or abstracts or suggestions that very mechanically forward, every single minute being counted. It feels a little clunky.
And importantly, none of it actually matters. The book is very specific on how everything is there to put the players off balance, to make them worried they're going to be late, but it can under no circumstance allow them to actually be late, and does make very explicit that they have to be back at their hotel before their reservation expires, and it goes out of its way to make sure that happens.
Though we also do have plenty of time regarding the expiration of the hotel reservation. At least the way I was reading it, the employer sets it up so we have at least 2 days of downtime afterwards to recover and go over a debriefing, which may or may not happen depending on how it is run. But in our case, it didn't really happen because we got paranoid and things happened. Plot.
Events proceeded.
Yeah, I suppose we probably should have warned people in the introduction that this was going to be very spoiler heavy, but I guess they probably figured that out by now.
Should go back and edit that in.
Yeah, you can always drop a spoiler warning earlier on, I'm pretty sure.
The spoiler warning presented by the products and services, of course.
The products and services that we wish supported this podcast.
Brought to you by Product.
I do like that the adventure.
HelloFresh, get in touch.
I do like that the adventure takes a moment to sort of describe the thinking behind having all of those delays, and like you've already mentioned, explicitly calls out that the intention is to make the players feel like they're on the back foot. And obviously, once you've read it, you can kind of see how the sausage is made. But I think when you're actually playing it and you don't know where it's going, there is actually anxiety that you might be late or that you might miss something.
Yeah, especially while playing through, I did find there was a little bit of anxiety to that, but this is also our group, so we are relatively good with keeping on time until the times that we're desperately late by several weeks, or avoiding the plot entirely.
Yeah, it feels as an odd dynamic, and I know this won't hold true for every group of players that engages in this game, but I feel that a lot of experienced role players would come to recognize the outline of a plot and the understanding that there is a plot, especially if they're going in to play a module. And it's somewhat difficult to maintain that sense of tension if you have that wider understanding of kind of how an RPG, especially a module, might play out. And as well, the way the delays are consistently presented is just things that will crop up that might make players late, but there's not any explicit mention in all of the descriptions of those delays as to how a group might get there faster or any way to alter that sense of lost time by the group or for the GM to suggest it. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess if the players come up with something interesting, the player can always give them that time back as a reward. And obviously, once you do get to the Macrodyne facility to pick up the arms equipment and the personnel you're supposed to be escorting, that translates into additional time to find and fix the problems with the equipment. But I think, given the intention of the adventure is to make you feel like you don't have enough time, are off kilter, and get there 10 minutes before you're supposed to be there, I don't know if the adventure really needs to give you a way to get that time back, since the intention is that you won't.
yes, I can definitely understand the intention they're going for there, and I think they did a decent job in that effort. It definitely evokes a feeling of being off kilter, like you might be late, maintaining tension and a high pace. Or the intention is, I feel, to maintain a high pace. I don't know that the amount of dice rolling it would call for would result in that, which is why I think probably if somebody is going to be running this, it wouldn't be much effort to take a slightly looser hand on the possible delays and just mention that there were delays of a certain amount of time rather than constantly rolling the d6s it calls for.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't roll the dice. I think that is very specifically an artifact of it being 1990. And this is what a role-playing game is. It's the game master playing with themselves with dice.
Well, you gotta get your rocks off somehow, and sometimes the math rocks need rolled.
I mean, there is a section later on in Operation Wild Goose where it actually suggests playing out the combat between two aerial vehicles that doesn't actually directly influence anything that happens to the player characters. It's just, I mean, it's cool, but it's the GM could just as easily say what happens.
Yeah, it's there for setting dressing.
To be a little crass, it's a little bit self-serving, self-aggrandizing, perhaps.
Though it does put in that, I think, off the top of my head, I did read this like 2 hours ago, that it was suggested that the players take the place of playing the two corporate jets. Not 100% sure off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that's what the book is saying as an idea to do, but of course it doesn't happen. It is just setting dressing.
Yeah.
It occurs to me now that as we're getting into this degree of detail about events we haven't described yet, people might start getting lost.
I was wondering if maybe Taranaki wanted to go back and just record flatly everything that happened and insert it where it would make sense to save us from ourselves. But
yeah, well, let's. I guess we can discuss what exactly Operation Wild Goose is. Like, what is? I mean, the intention, the backstory of the mission, and here is the heavy spoilers, is that two petrochemical companies one of them based in Texas, which in the universe of 2300 is an independent state, and the other one based in Mexico. Mexico wants to buy out the contract of a chemical engineer, and the Texan company is quite happy to take their money, but does not trust the Mexican company, and vice versa. So they come up with this very elaborate plan where two different teams will escort the chemical engineer going one way and the bagger of money going the other way, passing defined checkpoints at the same time interval, and then passing each other at the border, and then hopefully the mission going fine from there. Essentially with two teams of Shadowrunners playing escrow.
So you're approached by a friend to offer you the party, the job of being one of these teams. And if you don't already have a friend will be provided for you.
And the associated, what's it called? Friend accessories, of course.
Yes, the necessary secondary friend powers.
Telepathy and magic.
I could very easily see this being part of my standard rotation of, okay, somebody needs me to run Shadowrun tonight. What mission am I going to run? And also these people need something a little bit softball.
I think it, especially as an homage to those older Cyberpunk and Shadowrun games, I think it does it nicely where the concept of like data couriers or just couriers in general to move between corporate polities, in this case there are still nation states, technically there are in Shadowrun and Cyberpunk and stuff too, but a bit harder lines on the map I think for the nation states still apply, but even still, moving between those sort of corporate interests as a runner, as a courier of data, goods, people. I think it very nicely evokes those earlier genres, even if it feels a little bit weird that you wouldn't, use like an escrow and wire it digitally or something.
Well, I mean, mentioning the fact of it being a homage, this isn't a homage, this is the older thing. At the end of the book, it explicitly mentions that Shadowrun First Edition has just come out.
Right, fair point. Sorry. For people that have only experienced the original versions of these games vicariously, it feels like an homage, but no, I guess it's just perfectly in line with the time.
Yeah, this is the thing that the homages are homaging.
This was state of the art at the time.
I think, though, that in reference to, of course, Cyberpunk 2013, the Deathwatch program itself is a bit of a reference to Soulkiller, of course, because that is just what happened in Cyberpunk kind of shape.
That isn't what the Deathwatch program in the book was. That was what I changed it to because of issues that I had with what was in the second half of the adventure that I'm going to get on to mentioning. I suppose we might as well go on to that, where we get onto the section of Harefoot's run. As while you're doing Operation Wild Goose, an acquaintance of one of the members of the group is using your hotel room, either with your consent or without, to launch a net run. And I think this is really where the book starts going a little bit wrong. There's the fact that it introduces this idea of a cold storage program on Harefoot's deck that they just sort of have for no reason at all, which isn't very efficient storytelling, again, as written in the book. And then the fact that the actual MacGuffin, the titular Deathwatch program, is a... I have made the joke with Gespenst a few times that it is literally the protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's the agenda for a globalist financier conspiracy to take over the world.
Yeah, so if I may to quote, the Deathwatch program is primarily a timetable of hundreds of events to be brought about at various spots around the globe over the course of a 2-year period. The program reveals that there is a 94% chance that the cumulative effect of these events would be the collapse of the Western economy.
Why are all these dogs barking?
And then it goes on to detail more specifically which specific Western powers they consider to be within that remit.
Only a small mercy that they refer to the group executing this plan as a coven and not a cabal.
Yeah, I suppose it is worth pointing out in defense of the writer that this is a very standard cyberpunk cliche. and I think is actually a plot point in the video game Deus Ex, the original one, that is.
Yes.
Yes, well, I believe the original Deus Ex had an out-and-out Illuminati that was responsible for it.
This is definitely the period where people were taking those conspiracy theories and not realizing that they were dog whistles.
Well, it's tricky because it's not tricky. They are very rooted in anti-Semitism. That's undeniable. But there's an element of these conspiracy theories being prolific as story elements kind of all over the place, to the point where I'm not entirely convinced that every use of it is intended to be as a dog whistle, is, I guess, my hang up there, so much as it is kind of a broad trope in its own ways.
I mean, quite aside from anything else, there is just the fact that you have this cold storage program, which is necessary for the adventure to function, because you need the cold storage program to be able to explain all of the things that the player characters don't know.
And it's easily cool enough to be a MacGuffin in its own right.
And then also you have this actual MacGuffin that honestly is kind of boring. I mean, I know Gespenst mentioned to me that the Coven, the enemy, is simultaneously strong and weak.
Yeah, they have unlimited financial power, but also can't chase you beyond the edge of the solar system. They just have to give up then. If you talk to the police at Alpha Centauri, then their plans are foiled.
Yeah, and I think I'll mention...
Well, and sorry, there is a consistent, almost charming element to the way the corporations are presented throughout this, where at various different turns, there's just degrees of broad incompetence that kind of keep things on track, a comedy of errors all around, whether it be from a bandit ambush to corporates scrambling fighters to, invade foreign airspace, to pirate ships attempting to run you down, to hackers getting their brains fried. The corporation is consistently kind of incompetent, broadly.
It does feel like there's a large dose of comedy inserted into every interaction with any corporate entity or NPC. Like during Operation Wild Goose, the two CEOs are fighting each other more than anyone else, and then, like you say, they launch military aircraft into Mexican airspace, and the Mexican government takes exception to that, and then they all just kind of exit stage right in a big comedy ball of dust, unless you actually decide to run the combat yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's also worth mentioning in case anybody else earnestly wants to run this adventure, what I did to make the Deathwatch program more interesting, which is that I did basically turn it into Arasaka's Soul Killer, and consequently made the Coven be part of Trilon rather than sort of this independent body.
Yes, and rather making it a distinct corporate entity to sort of move away from the problems of the initial conspiracy, I think works better because, to my recollection, initially in the book itself, Harefoot's target for the hack is, quote, One World Zurich Bank. So it gets a bit more dog whistly there.
I hadn't realized that. I mean, I'd also chosen Trilon because there was a point where I was a little bit worried that things might get sidetracked, and there is a map of the Trilon building in the adventure Rotten to the Core. So I had that in my back pocket that we could switch tracks into that adventure instead. Did you want to say something, Gespenst?
I was just surprised you hadn't noticed the fact that it was a conspiracy by the One World Bank in Zurich or whatever it was. That leapt out to me as well.
Well, in my defence, I read this a lot longer than you guys. As I've not really reread it since running the adventure, even though I did set this as homework for you people, you folk. I didn't subject myself to it.
Yeah, no, we're meant to be supplemental.
Yeah.
Although I can't help but notice that once again we went on to the impressions of the material, and I feel like we might not quite have discussed the material. So you have the party returning from their escapades in Mexico, could have taken them sort of anywhere between a morning and 2 days, depending on how badly things go wrong. The book does actually include the possibility that you might be kidnapped by the road warriors that ambush you on the way. You come back to your hotel by whatever roads take you there, and you discover that Harefoot, who has either been let into your hotel room or has let herself into your hotel room, has done a bunch of cyber crimes and killed an assassin, and then run off with the plot. So hopefully the crew decides to follow her, and of course if they don't, the book has ways to make you follow her,
such as assassins and murder and the police.
And the Mad Bomber, what bombs at midnight.
That one. Yes, we do love the Mad Bomber who bombs at midnight.
Yeah,
and sorry, this is kind of a point where I feel the adventure got in its own way, where its attempt to make things chaotic, confusing, and keep the players off balance sort of hurts the player side clarity of the adventure, because going into it doing a corporate job, although people are likely to have been less genre savvy at the time this was written, still I feel that they would pick up on the fact that transporting this chemical engineer between the two companies and getting ambushed en route and having a military aircraft Mexican standoff between the Macrodyne, Petromin, and the Mexican military would be more than sort of a showpiece. But it turns out to have ultimately just been exactly that. And I feel like that's going to cause something of a red herring, as the players would be very likely to connect the corporate contract and betrayal and all that stuff to their friends' hacking escapades.
I hadn't considered that. I thought the coming back and finding the body in your hotel room was quite good, because it created a really great point to sort of end that first session.
It is a fantastic cliffhanger moment, especially evoking that sort of TV episode feel to it. And I think it is quite good as a stopping point if you can get there for the end of a session. But it's an element for me that I always find hard to overlook, where the adventure starts by presenting you all of these details and drawing you in with a great deal of granular attention to all the small elements of the deal between these two companies, calling in an old friend for a job, or being called in by an old friend for a job, there being a standoff, expectations of betrayal. It all points to this being a thing that will matter, and then it instantly ceases to be anything relevant. And I just feel a lot of groups could be thrown off the scent by that, because I was initially as well.
Yeah, it's a great stopping point, but you do, at least from my brain, when we were running through it, it was a bit of a, okay, this has happened, there's Matrix reference, of course, as is required with all of this. And then after that, it's a bit of a crossroads of, hey, what are we going to do next? Because there's been a guy murdered, and then things are going to happen. And then everything is kind of being said on my perspective on that.
Not actually a Matrix reference, I should note, because that came out in 1999.
Unintentionally. Forward Matrix reference. Setting up the Matrix.
It's predicting the Matrix. But even more worryingly than that, we were mentioning data couriers before. This predates Johnny Mnemonic by 5 years.
Oh no, this inspired Johnny Mnemonic. How horrible.
Johnny Mnemonic was based on a short story, and I don't think this predates the short story.
I don't think it does.
Probably not. But it does predate the Keanu Reeves movie, one of the touchstones for the genre, I'm sure.
After you find the body, of course, it then introduces the assassin, which is supposed to provide an incentive for the players to actually pursue the adventure. In case they refuse the call for adventure, the call for adventure blows up your car.
It's a much more cyberpunky way to have orcs kick in the door.
I mean, my biggest problem with this is, at least at this point, what it does is very cliche. The idea that, you go to your car and there's someone breaking in, and then your car explodes, magnavolting the would-be thief is cyberpunk cliche number 47 on my standard things to do if I run out of ideas for the game.
I agree, but again, looking at the age and relative novelty of this particular module's release, I think it's fine. Like, it's a little tongue-in-cheek nowadays, but even still, I think it's fine. But I still wasn't super clear as to how that would necessarily spur the group to want to track down Harefoot, just being aware that somebody was trying to kill them as well. Or, well, I suppose tracking down Harefoot makes sense, but the full extent of the pursuit feels strained from that single encounter.
Yeah, I was very much halfway to Alpha Centauri before I realised I didn't actually know why I was chasing Harefoot.
Pretty sure we were in Alpha Centauri when we figured out that. We had a discussion in that final session, didn't we?
I think that discussion took place while you were in transit.
Close enough.
It did. I mean, yeah, if we're intending to discuss the module, I don't know how much we want to get super in-depth to our particular experience with playing it, given that certain details were changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can definitely agree, though, that the Medusa does a good job of spurring the players on to do something. It just may not necessarily do a great job of spurring them on to staying in this adventure.
Yes. If you're... I mean, I feel that the initial part of the module, the adventure, is an excellent soft introduction to the 2300 world and some cyberpunk themes and a fun storyline. It's quite evocative, good hook. And if it turns out that the unfortunate car thief that has alerted you to this threat doesn't spur the group to go chasing Harefoot to the stars, at the very least, it's a great kicking off point for any number of other adventures, and I think easily adaptable, because at the point in time where the bombing goes off, the group's not really going to have any knowledge as to who has done it or why in great detail, and so that's very much a nebulous detail that you can change.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if the player characters decide to ignore Harefoot and just like run away, go to ground or something, you know, that you can immediately improvise enough material to take you to the end of a session.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, though, is that I was a little bit worried about as written, is that it describes that after Medusa plants that bomb, they get called away to New York on a red herring lead, which could make sense, but I was a little bit worried that rather than chasing Harefoot, the player characters might decide to chase the Medusa.
Yeah, I think if we weren't already integrated with Harefoot being kind of friends, we would probably have ended up chasing that red herring with little... I mean, some direction to go, but especially after everything, it's kind of, are we going to chase after her? Because she has just kind of hijacked her room and everything. There's a bomb threat on us. Do we chase it, or do we go to ground? Is very much kind of the first thing that was on my mind whilst playing through. But we did have more than one player who was like, yes, let's go chase after Harefoot. She's going to be the primary lead, of course.
Well, there is this conundrum as well, where there's, again, for this second part of the adventure, a very strict timetable that it tries to present. So the group really doesn't have time to go to ground or explore too many other leads before they will have fallen very far behind what the adventure is presenting for its means of getting the group to follow Harefoot off to Alpha Centauri and terrain.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you pursue... I mean, what I did was I kept the Medusa in Texas and kept them in play as a potential threat that I could imply all the way up to Gateway, I think. And I think that works because if the player characters decide to chase the Medusa instead, I think it's a lot easier to improvise that if you stay within the bounds of Corpus Christi, and you can use the Medusa to deliver at least some of the exposition you would have got with Harefoot. Speaking of the pursuit of Harefoot, as written, I think there are way too many dead ends and red herrings included on the on that page, including one NPC who just straight up lies and sends the player characters to a strip club for no discernible reason.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fairly obvious which bits of that you would cut to streamline that path down, but I think it does definitely require the experience to know what to cut there.
Yeah, and that's, I think, kind of evocative of the module as a whole, which is there's definitely a core of good ideas, but it branches out a lot of times, and if pruned, I think you get something pretty solid, but it's exploratory. I mean, it is new as far as the genre goes, so it's taking some chances and has some ideas that I think over time we've learned to do a bit better.
Yeah, and I mean, that my whole reason for doing this review, I'm hoping, is that somebody sees it and decides, oh, we could reprint this in an updated form with perhaps some of these issues fixed, but just as a second pass over this draft.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, with that solid core there, I don't think it would take an exceptional amount of effort or reworking to get something much more modernized. I would say polished, but that's not quite the right word. So I'll go modernized.
Yeah. And then when you do finally find out that Harefoot has booked passage aboard the Columbus, there isn't really anything that happens to you as written during the journey from Corpus Christi to Gateway. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities that stood out to me as places where I could have inserted the Medusa if I felt that maybe the pacing of the game was lagging slightly, like whether that's the train to San Antonio Airport or the flight itself,
Or encounter on Gateway.
So, but it more or less skips straight on to you booking passage aboard a smuggling ship to catch up with the Columbus, which was a part of the adventure that we didn't use because you guys had a scout ship instead that you wanted to use, which was fine. And then, as written, I kind of had an issue because what's supposed to happen is you book passage aboard this ship called the Daisy May, and then while the Daisy May is pursuing the Columbus to catch up with it, a fighter is supposed to attempt to intercept the Daisy May, and then the captain of the Daisy May reveals that he just so happens to have 2 nuclear missiles, which is so silly.
It is exceptionally strange. I mean, it's not the only time in the plot where it has those mild contrivances to keep the players safe. I mean, in the initial ambush, something else that stood out as odd to me was in the ambush going to Mexico, there was the problem where the bandits had an anti-vehicular missile, yet also are stated to have the motivation of not wanting to kill all the player characters and gather the cargo of the vehicle intact. It happens to miss by convenience of it being stated that it misses because the bandit was startled. But it does stand at odds with their stated intentions. And then this feels kind of like an escalation of that. We've created a plot point that we need a way out of, so we'll invent a solution, but it's patently absurd.
Yeah, there's no real stakes to it. Meanwhile, with our own ship, there was kind of some stakes to it, and we did set up that task chain, which was really pretty good to go through. And thinking of how we could get out of it. But as someone who's rather experienced with talking with fishing people, of course, everyone I know does mount a Davy Crockett on their fishing boat just to make sure.
I mean, the thing that bothers me the most is that the story introduces this threat, and then an NPC resolves this threat, and it requires absolutely no input from any player character at all.
The thing is, from the moment you know, in the book as written, you go down a certain number of dead ends and then maybe eventually find your way to the antique shop. And from entering the antique shop to entering Harefoot's room on the ship. The game just plays itself. The NPC has the contact who gets you on the smuggling ship, who takes you to catch up with the Columbia, and then the enemies attack, and then the NPC deals with the attack. The game just plays itself for about 30 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, what I intended to do with that encounter is I was going to add a second crew member to the Daisy May, and then have it so that when the fighter pursues the Daisy May, which does not have those missiles, the captain would have been persuaded to surrender to the ship, unaware of like the assassins who had tried to blow you up earlier in the story. He would have surrendered, believing in good faith that if I simply hand you people over, I get to leave this adventure. And then, you as player characters would have to somehow convince him to not do that, or knock him out and keep the engineer unaware, or some other complicated, possibly violent interpersonal solution.
Which would have given me a good excuse to use my shock gloves that I was wearing the whole adventure and never found an opportunity to use.
I should have used them on the police. They deserve it.
I feel that would have ended poorly. Especially because they could just get up again like 2 minutes later.
Then you do it again. There's plenty of charge.
It's unfortunately not a Star Trek phaser. I can't just set my gloves to stun and solve the problem.
Anyway, the adventure suitably playing itself and delivering you to the Columbus, where you're supposed to find Harefoot already dead. You then find this cold storage program that has managed to save a copy of Harefoot's consciousness.
The cold storage program that she just so happened to steal last week, coincidentally.
And also she doesn't have enough money. And also she didn't have enough money and was so desperate to launch this Shadowrun on the World Bank, despite having this very expensive program.
She kept it because it might become useful later.
That I vaguely remember reading that she was wanting to fence it off to a fixer or another runner, but to distribute to the net. But that is off the top of my head.
But importantly, you find this cold storage program that can then explain to you all of the stuff that the adventure has failed to explain to you for the last 2 sessions.
Stuff that the book went into great detail on as it was happening, but none of us saw because it was all happening to Harefoot off screen.
And then abruptly ends, full on handbrake parks the adventure as it just tells you go to the police, and then everything's fine.
Go to the police and collect your 1 kudo. Attaboy, the police say.
And this is there's a review on RPG.net of this adventure that I think the great conclusion is that this adventure ends in you going to the police, which is the least cyberpunk thing you can do.
Yeah,
that's true. And it even has that as Harefoot's initial direction too. Is Harefoot discovers this Deathwatch program and is immediately like, I know who will help, the cops.
I know who will never side with the corporate security in this cyberpunk dystopia.
Meanwhile, I think this would lead on really, really well as like an introduction to a campaign, as many module books end up happening to be, where you take a leaf out of cyberpunk and do Never Fade Away several times.
Well, that was the path that I took because I changed the Deathwatch program and cold storage to be this soul killer idea. That then meant that when you got to this point and the adventure ended without necessarily a clear path forwards, there were lots of easily obvious things for the player characters to suggest to themselves to do, like, we could fence this.
You could take down the corporation, blow up the government, do some proper stuff. Things that PCs should be doing.
What do we do with this hacker in a box? And obviously Harefoot, wants a new body, but that doesn't necessarily mean the player characters have to give it to her, particularly depending on the amount of grief that she may have put them through up to this point.
Which is likely to be considered substantial if, for any reason, the player characters were less than fully accepting of her need to use their hotel room. depending on their knowledge of what Harefoot does prior to her breaking in and hacking things, they very much might be inclined not to, considering they would likely have knowledge that she's a hacker who looks like she hasn't slept in 24 hours and is haggard and needs somewhere to nap before a short-term midnight flight. It's going to give you a lot of indications that it's something shady, something probably criminal that you wouldn't want to allow. And if you don't allow Harefoot in, she breaks in and is quoted to believe that whatever fallout there is, the PCs are better suited to handle than Harefoot, and so they can deal with it. So it very much is just dump all of Harefoot's problems in the player character's laps and hope that they're amenable to forgiving her.
This is why I think this would work really well as a second adventure, with Harefoot and Milo being characters you met in a previous adventure. Like, say you did a shadow run where you had to hack into something, but of course no one brings a netrunner because that makes the game boring for everyone. Although people probably hadn't come to that conclusion in 1990. So obviously you need an NPC to be a netrunner. So, oh yeah, there's this Harefoot character, and she's so helpful, and then she runs into you again in your next session, and she needs a room to crash in. You're like, yeah, sure, Harefoot, you were such a great help last week. Come and sleep in our room while we go and play silly buggers in Mexico.
Well, I certainly like the idea that, you would obtain this cold storage program of Harefoot and perhaps be in a state where you were a bit pissed off at Harefoot, so that the idea of selling this program as, a part of getting something out of this run, particularly bearing in mind that, we were quite clear that it's sort of ambiguous whether this is actually Harefoot at all or just a program that thinks it's Harefoot, at least makes the bad karma solution palatable. Like, it's something that can be tabled.
That is just a question of philosophy, though.
Well, yes, but it's more interesting if the bad karma thing you can do to get money is something that is at least plausible to discuss and not mustache-twirlingly evil.
Yeah, just sell her back to the corporation. She'll be fine. She can be put in cold storage again. It's just, this is what happens, and then we get more jobs from the corps, and get to be evil bastards.
Which, once again, is a not very cyberpunk solution. Or at least not very punk.
It's the cyber without the punk, but of course we should burn down the corporations and then the government.
A lot has been written, and most of it in the last few years, about what is and isn't cyberpunk. But I feel that Fuck You Got Mine is in fact the most cyberpunk thing.
It is. I think it's fair to say that in a lot of cyberpunk fiction and role-playing games, it's very common for A, Fuck You Got Mine, and B, for the cybers that are supposedly punk to end up selling out to the corporations.
Well, that's it. You're not doing these shadow runs to do good. You're doing these shadow runs to get rich.
Unless you're one of those bizarre people that play at the super low street level, you're actually working as just proper fixers or troubleshooters for scenarios where the neighborhood granny hasn't gotten her rent money.
But even then, the goal of the street level campaign is to escape the street. You're just running a gang. You're solving local people's problems so that they'll pay you protection money.
Doing well by doing good.
Yeah. It's very rare that you have an altruistic Shadowrun or Cyberpunk game, although I always find it entertaining when they try to accommodate that in their rulebooks, which I've seen a few times.
It's definitely more popular. At the risk of going on a kids these days tangent, it is definitely more popular these days because I think tastes in role-playing games have changed.
Yes, they undeniably have.
People don't want to play bastards anymore.
Well, yes, that is an element. I think it's also just become a wider market that can afford to cater to more niches.
I mean, I think there is a definite a Twitter brain thing where people start thinking that putting a thing in media means that you are implicitly endorsing the bad thing. Like you can't have colonial violence in your role-playing game because that means you're endorsing colonial violence.
Yes, I've seen an element of that. It makes it a very tricky line to walk, especially because of how word count and page limits come into play. It can almost be an editorial decision solely to not include an idea you have, if only because the amount of disclaimers that would probably feel obligated to put in to get away with including the colonial power that represents some particular stereotype of a group or what have you in any way, shape, or form.
Like Eat the Reich, but Eat the Reich does it well.
But Eat the Reich is like, what, 100 and something pages long, and it probably has 10 pages of disclaimers if you stack them all up.
Which is then the intention of that disclaimer is to be, hey, we're not endorsing this, but we need to say we're not endorsing this.
I mean, I know it's difficult because obviously the opposite end of this is all of these 90s role-playing games that I adore because I grew up with them, where you play Bastards, where it secretly turns out that there was a group of players who enjoyed playing Bastards for very different reasons to me.
Yeah.
And it turns out they weren't playing Bastards.
Yes, it reminds me of my early experiences with Vampire the Masquerade, where it was a 50-50 shot if you were going to find a group that was like, yeah, we really like pretending to be fascist bastards as part of the Camarilla because it's cool. And the other half was, no, we're literally Nazis. That could be something of a local phenomenon, but a lot of those darker and edgier games from the 90s that I got to play had a tendency to do exactly as you said, occasionally attract outright bastards.
I think I think it's just that the only reason I didn't notice at the time is I was a much more naive person. But I suppose the last thing to discuss is the end of the book, where it discusses Game Master advice for how to run this with other systems.
As the Game Master, perhaps you should lead off on that one.
Well, it mentions how there's a shortage of cyberpunk-themed adventure modules, since Cyberpunk and Shadowrun are the only two sort of dedicated cyberpunk TTRPGs out there, and there just isn't anything. There just aren't like a huge catalogue of adventures, I guess, because when you even in 1990, when you talk about Traveller, you had this huge catalogue of JTAS issues that you could just go to and grab an Amber Zone adventure and prep that, and that's your evening.
Yeah.
Whereas in this, it mentions how basically your only example adventures are the Shadowrun, the one that comes with the Shadowrun Game Master screen, and a adventure that had just been published called Mercurial, which I think is like one of those fan favorite Shadowrun adventures that everyone raves about, but I never actually got to play.
Mercurial is almost certainly correct. That is a 1989 Shadowrun module. I don't happen to know anything more about it, though.
So I suppose general conclusions: good module, bad module?
Good module, but it can use some a little bit of updating and definitely a little bit of bending towards being more functional in today's understanding of tabletop gaming.
It has a lot of charm, especially in the first half. There's a lot to like about it, like when you're avoiding the road warriors and 3 different factions of aircraft are bearing down on you and CEOs are bickering on the radio, and you're just trying to escape with your payday.
But importantly, none of the things you mentioned as being good are things that happen in the Deathwatch program.
It's all in the book.
I think the adventure starts on a very good note. Overall, I can only say that I have mixed feelings about it because I have mixed feelings about the sort of 2 halves of the adventure. Operation Wild Goose, the initial starting point, I think is fantastic. I really enjoy the feel of it. It has a nice touch of comedy to go along with the traditional dystopia that you're expected to be in. It's action-packed. If you get the pacing down as opposed to rolling constant D6s, I think it's very solid. Then you transition to the later part with the Deathwatch program, and it feels like it requires a much more careful hand guiding the direction of play to make sure that the players actually stay within the module. It feels like the elements presented there are a little bit hacky to more modern tastes and intended to, in their own way, throw players directly off the scent. And you have the issue of the as-written presentation of the Deathwatch module, which is not great, as we've established.
I mean, I liked it, obviously, because I liked it enough to run it, and I liked it enough to do this review. Thanks for joining me. I think we can stop recording here, unless there's anything anyone wants to jump in with at the end.
There's always time for the products and services which support this programming, of course. Such as Blue Apron.
Oh, of course, and
Doritos, sponsor us.
no, we're sponsored by.
Today's program sponsored by Monster Energy Drink, as that's what I was having.
Oh, you too?
No, we're sponsored by the Footlong Egg.
The and the footlong sausage.
The standout of the entire adventure that didn't get mentioned once: the footlong egg and the 2-foot-long burger.
Well, you know what the manufacturers of the footlong egg and the footlong burger really, really want? They, of course, want you to sponsor the episode of this review program, which you are currently watching and listening to, one of the two, by buying the products and services.
I think I'm going to end my recording.